Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Everyone's filing in, so we'll give people about 30 seconds to a minute before we start. Okay, you have tuned in to insights about first generation students from the 2024 Student Financial Wellness Survey. My name is Andrea Gonzalez with Trellis Strategies, and we're so happy to have you join us this afternoon for a little bit of professional development and to learn more about the disparities of first generation students, as well as some tips to support them on your campuses. Anyone who registered for this webinar will receive a recording of this once we have it edited and ready for sharing. We do have slides that we'll share at the end of this presentation. And if you have questions throughout the webinar, we do encourage you to share them either in the chat or the Q&A. We will get to those at the end of the presentation. And now that we have folks leveling off, I will go ahead and hand it over to our presenter today, Lydia Mincer, our research analyst. It's all yours, Lydia.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Lydia, and I'm a research analyst here at Trellis Strategies. Today, as Andrea said, we're going to be talking about first-generation college students and what the 2024 Student Financial Wellness Survey tells us about their financial, academic, and well-being experiences. This presentation is intended to ground us both in the data and highlight what it means for institutional decision-making and student-facing practice. Throughout, we can focus on not just the challenges that these students face, but also on where institutions have real leverage to improve outcomes for them. We'll start off with an introduction of Trellis Strategies. If you don't know us, we're a research organization and nonprofit with nearly 40 years of mixed method research experience and consulting services. We provide data analytics, surveys, and customer research experiences that contribute to positive transformations in both education and workforce development. So the data for today's presentation comes from the Student Financial Wellness Survey. This survey is free to institutions that we provide as part of our community investment as a nonprofit. We use these results to produce customized reports and infographics for the participating schools, and we also produce more aggregated reports for the public sphere for policymakers and on various topics from the survey, like first-generation students today. Institutions have used the results from this survey to raise money, develop programs, assess initiatives, assign resources, and just build that culture of caring on college campuses. In total, we collected over 50,000 responses in the fall 2024 Student Financial Wellness Survey. Out of those responses, about 16,500 were first-generation students, with about 9,300 of those students being from two-year institutions and a couple less with 7,000 students from four-year institutions out of that population. So, why are we looking at first-generation students? Well, today, they represent a substantial portion of a student population, and in this data set, more than 1/3 of the students were first-generation. We define first generation here as students whose parents had not attended college in the past. National research consistently shows gaps in degree attainment, financial security, and long-term outcomes between first generation and continuing generation students. For example, while 70% of continuing generation adults have bachelor degrees, only 26% of first generation adults have reached the same achievement. What's important for institutions is that these gaps are not just about motivation or ability. They're really about access to information, resources, and support systems that first-generation students may not have. That's why we're going to take a look holistically at finances, mental health, and basic needs, because these factors consistently shape whether or not students can persist and complete their academic journeys. So, who are these first generation students? In the fall 2024 Student Financial Wellness Survey, 36% of respondents identified themselves as first generation, which closely aligns itself with national estimates. Compared to continuing generation peers, first gen students are more likely to be financially independent from their families, more likely to work while enrolled, and more likely to balance family or caregiving responsibilities outside of their academic journeys. These characteristics really matter because they shape how students experience institutional processes, from things like financial aid, advising, and course scheduling. And they leave students more vulnerable to stopping out due to lack of information and family to support them through education-related challenges. It also kind of shows us how a one-size-fits-all student support model can often be less effective for this group as they have different needs. As we look closer, we'll start off with financial characteristics of first generation students, as the finances play a vital role in student success and program completion. One of the clearest differences we can see between first and continuing generation students is the prevalence of financial stress among first generation college students. On the left, we can see that 80% of first generation students reported experiencing financial difficulties, compared to 67% of continuing generation students. That difference is really meaningful, not just statistically, but practically. Financial stress affects how much cognitive and emotional bandwidth these students have available for learning, engagement, and help seeking for themselves. On the right, here we can see that over half of first generation students, or 55%, have difficulty concentrating on their schoolwork because of their financial situations. On an institution level, this reinforces that resources related to affordability and financial support aren't just peripheral issues for these students, they're often central to their success. When we look at students running out of money, we see how these financial difficulties can show up in very concrete ways for students. First generation students were significantly more likely to run out of money multiple times per year. 37% ran out of money 6 or more times in the past year, and over 2/3 would have trouble getting $500 in either cash or credit if they needed it for an unexpected expense within the next month. When students are running out of money this frequently and without any safety nets, they're not only just making small adjustments, they're making these large trade-offs between food, housing, transportation, their families, and their academics. This is where financial insecurity becomes an academic risk factor and not just a financial risk. Employment is another key part of the picture. Of the first generation students who reported working, over 50% indicated the main reason that they work during school is to pay for their educations. When asked about work intensity, nearly half of working first generation students reported working 40 or more hours per week. On the right here, we can say that 62% say that work interferes with their extracurricular engagement, and 31% said that work made them miss at least one day of class in the last semester. When compared to continuing generation students, these disruptions in extracurriculars and classes were less common. Only 22% of continuing first generation students reported that their work had caused them to miss class in the last semester. For practitioners, this can really explain why some students may appear to be disengaged. They simply don't have the discretionary time to be spending on extracurriculars and things outside of their classwork. It raises questions about course scheduling, on-campus employment opportunities, and how we really define full participation in the college experience. First-generation students also reported higher difficulty navigating the FAFSA and the financial aid process. Many experienced stress and anxiety related to delays and uncertainty, particularly in the 2024 FAFSA cycle. When we look at how these students are paying for college, they're also much less likely to receive financial support from their family members, which means institutional aid decisions often carry much more weight. Here we can see that 65% of first generation students rely on grants to pay for their college. And if we look on the right, we can see that through self-help, their current employment is a significant fund of their academic journeys as well. However, these financial stresses don't really exist in isolation. It connects directly to students' well-being and mental health challenges. First-generation students reported higher rates of mental health challenges, both for depression and anxiety. 37% showed signs of depression and 49% showed signs of anxiety, both of which were higher than their continuing generation peers. These differences might be driven by multiple factors like financial stress, family responsibilities, unfamiliar academic environments, and limited social capital. But importantly, I want to make sure that we know that this doesn't mean that first generation students are less resilient. It just means that oftentimes they're carrying more simultaneous pressures. Mental health is closely linked to persistence for students, including course performance and completion. First generation students may be less familiar with how to access counseling or may be less likely to view services as for them. Institutions that normalize help seeking and clearly communicate available services tend to see better engagement with their mental health services. This is an area where relatively low-cost interventions like clearer messaging and embedded referrals through faculty members can have a really meaningful impact for these students. As we look at basic needs insecurity with both food and housing security, it's important to reflect that across all three basic needs categories, 13% of first generation students were classified as being insecure across all of their needs. This was nearly double the rate of 7% that we saw in continuing generation students. Looking more specifically here at food security, more than half of first-generation students reported low or very low food security. Fortunately, on the right here, we can see that first-generation students have similar levels of awareness and utilization of resources, such as food pantries, on their campuses. However, only about half of both first and continuing generation students knew that their schools had these pantries or closets on campus, suggesting that better marketing and awareness may improve utilization of these resources by those who really need it the most. Housing stands as one of the most fundamental needs that students and just us as humans require for success, not just for their academic journeys, but for the students' overall health, safety, and stability. Housing safety is just crucial. Over half of first generation students reported housing insecurity. In addition, 18% of first generation students scored high on the homelessness risk scale. When students are worried about how they'll sleep or how they'll eat, academic success and things like that become secondary. So this reinforces that basic need support are not just extra services for these students. They're really core to their student success infrastructure. Looking at the additional responsibilities that first generation students may carry, these first gen students are also more likely to be parents or guardians. 25% reported caregiving responsibilities, and many missed class due to their childcare challenges. These responsibilities just compound the financial and academic pressures that they're already experiencing. Policies around attendance, flexibility, and emergency support are all areas in which they can make meaningful differences for these students. Now that we've looked at the financial and well-being aspects of these students, it's time to look at what institutions can actually do to help them. Research has shown that isolated interventions are less effective than coordinated systems of support for first-generation students. Promising practices have included things like proactive advising, early transition programs like summer bridge or first-year seminars, and structured tutoring and mentoring for these students. One key takeaway is the importance of creating a sense of belonging in an institutional family for first-generation students that they might not be receiving at home. To wrap up, I think that for institutions, the implications for first generation students are clear. Supports for first generation students should be proactive rather than reactive, and that financial, academic, and well-being services should be integrated into these students' coursework rather than siloed into separate accesses. And just as importantly, institutions must ensure that first generation students know that these supports exist and feel encouraged and welcomed to use them. As a whole, first-gen students bring resilience, motivation, and determination to higher education that we might not see from their continuing generation peers. But at the same time, they're facing intersecting challenges that institutions have the power to address. Intentional, holistic strategies can narrow these equity gaps and improve outcomes, not just for first-generation students, but for the broader student population that may be experiencing the same troubles. Thank you, and I'm happy to discuss any questions or ideas about how these findings connect to your work. If you're interested in participating in the 2026 Student Financial Wellness Survey, here's some information for that here. So for questions, let me see if I can find my chat here.
To Nita, the steps to participate in the survey, if you go to that website, you can click on participate in the survey in the coming year. And pretty exciting news, our results are going to be published soon. We have a webinar. Yes, our results are being shared on Monday, April the 6th. So let me put a link for that webinar here. And these are going to be results from fall 2025.
Yes.
Okay.
Alrighty. I did get one question personally. So how do work responsibilities affect first generation students academically? So we did discuss previously that first generation students were more likely to work over 40 hours a week, more likely to have multiple jobs, and more likely to miss class because of their employment. So first generation students are more likely to work these long hours and agree that employment limits their ability to fully engage in campus life. So these students are often balancing employment out of necessity and not choice, which will affect their time studying, being able to go to advising, and access things like mental health resources. So that's definitely a way that we'll see lower GPAs and degree attainment from the first generation students. Okay, from Nui, from a researcher's perspective, what is the most impressive finding about first generation students did you have when working on this brief? I think that's something that I found pretty insightful about first generation students is that they're appreciation for their degrees and their perspectives on their return on investment were actually quite high. They were usually higher than our continuing generation students. And I think that really shows why these students are so determined to get these degrees, is because they do understand that this is going to help them move forward in their lives and in their careers and things like that.
And I just responded to Nita in the chat. You can email surveys at trellisstrategies.org and inquire about your institution's participation, because it's true, your institution may be participating and you don't even know. So definitely just email that account and ask any questions you may have about the process or past participation, etc.
Yeah, and Nita, in response to your question about results available more granularly, that's not something that we specifically focus on in this brief. I can go to my previous slide and link that brief as well if you're interested in reading it. But you might be able to find some of those findings in our other research briefs about student parents and things like that in the Student Financial Wellness Survey. And that's something we can also look at from our 2025 results once those are published as well.
I put the link to this brief in the chat just in case someone wants to quickly click. Seems like we answered all the questions.
Yes, and if there's anything else that comes up, feel free to shoot me an email. I also have access to that surveys at trellisstrategies.org email, so just let me know.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're going to close out this webinar today. And like I said, we will be sending out a recording of this once the editing is done, and we will also include a PDF of this presentation. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, and we wish you a good rest of your day.
Yes, thank you, everyone.